There is just so much, there's just even so much in the Lord's Prayer I won't possibly be able to get to today. But as I always say, please let me know if you want me to come back to any of this. Whenever someone speaks to me and says, I wish you'd said more on that, or I would like to hear a sermon or a series on this, I've got a wee notepad that I write it down in, and quite often it informs what I'll preach on the next year. So I do like to be user and content generated and led, as they say. What is the secret to contentment? Lots of answers to that, as I said earlier. There's something here that I think links this entire chapter, and it's even in the Lord's Prayer, that I think is still so relevant and continues to cry out to us in terms of being helpful, being spiritually applicable, but being much more applicable more broadly in our culture and in our world. Because this is something, maybe more than ever in the 21st century, we struggle with now in our particular part of the world and in this particular culture, is actually being content, really content and at peace. And we have so many enemies to our contentment. We have so much distraction, we have so much information, we have so much fighting for our attention. But within that, we've got to remember Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's giving them, if you like, the manifesto of what the kingdom of God is going to look like. You see, people had been expecting a king and a ruler for quite a long time, for hundreds of years. And he comes in, and the Lord's Prayer, a good way to read it is as the manifesto for the way Jesus wants his followers to be in this world. And it's got actually really staggering, earth-shattering claims about the way people who follow God are meant to walk in this world. They were earth-shattering at the time, and believe me, they are earth-shattering now. Because if we could live this way, if we could follow this manifesto, then I think it would almost be its own advert for Christianity. Mahatma Gandhi is false. It's probably falsely attributed to him as saying that I like your Christ, but your Christians I don't like very much. Now, Mahatma Gandhi was not much of an authority on Christ or Christianity, but that quote is used and shared because there can be a gap between the sort of the lifestyle and the pattern of Jesus, and sometimes over time what our churches and our institutions and our form of doing things can become. There can be this huge gap and this separation. And so it's always good to go back to, if you like, the manifesto. What were we supposed to be committed to? How did Jesus say contentment would come for us, and how did we say we could then show it and offer it to other people? More specifically, what are the enemies in this passage, the absolute obstacles that stand in the way of contentment? I would argue from reading this, and I hope together you'll agree with me once we've been through the chapter, that they are worrying about what others think and stuff, materialism. Now, these things come into the areas of worship. Jesus says that our worship can be affected by this. Possessions, the stuff we can accumulate, and what the condition of our soul says about that, and how that interferes with the condition of our soul. And lastly, provision. Worship, possessions, and provision. We're going to think about how the obstacles to our contentment are seen through what Jesus says about those topics. Jesus talks about prayer, he talks about fasting, and he talks about giving. Three, if you like, cornerstones of what it was to worship in the ancient Near East when he's speaking to a group of mostly a Jewish audience. And he's saying, I agree with you. Those things are essential to being somebody who follows God. Yes, you should give. Yes, you should fast. Yes, you should pray. And in the Sermon on the Mount previous weeks, we've been thinking about how Jesus kept almost like a surgeon going to the very heart and the very soul of the person, going, it's fine if you look like you're doing the right thing by not murdering someone, but do you hate them? You remember that last week and how challenging it was? Now he's going to do the same thing with worship. And you can almost, if you were there, being one of the disciples, you could see them kind of thinking, is there anything he isn't going to leave alone in terms of the fact that there's more required? Is there anything he's not going to surgically go into in terms of our heart? And no, there isn't. He's now going to go for worship. And look at this picture that he paints when it comes to prayer. Don't be like the hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward. And he says the same thing about people that give and make a big deal of it, and people that fast and make sure that they look as miserable as sin while they're doing so that everyone know how holy and special that they are. And he's saying, and you know, I'm sure there were people in Jesus' crowd who were sitting quite smugly going, I'm a very, very erudite person when it comes to praying. I know exactly. I could pray for an hour, probably, upwards of an hour. In fact, I am so confident in that. I do it in front of other people very prominently. So what could be better than praying for an hour? What could possibly be more holy than that? And Jesus is saying it's nonsense. Because why are you doing it? And he's even saying that the human heart is so subtle, so it can even take something as good as giving and fasting and praying, all on the surface things which look like amazing spiritual disciplines, and they can be totally distorted. Why? Because they're done as a performance rather than an act of worship. And he's saying when that becomes a performance, it is no longer an act of worship. And that line he uses is really strong. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. You know what he's saying? That as an act of work, if it's supposed to be about connecting with God, rather than going up vertically, it's going to cross horizontally, and that's where it's going to end. That person got exactly what they wanted out of it. They wanted other people to applaud and say that they're wonderful, or even just to notice them. And he's saying that's the end of it. It did nothing. It made it look like it was meant for God, but it wasn't. And so it achieved what it was supposed to. But it misses out on the spiritual vitality of building something up with God. And you know, this is not me beating any of you with a stick for the way that you pray. I don't even know the people in Erskine Parish Church particularly struggle with terribly performative religion. It's maybe a symptom more in different parts of the church. I remember being in kind of charismatic circles where it was all about who could raise their hands the highest and be seen to be worshipping God the most. But clergy aren't exempt from this. I think, if anything, this is something to be more mindful for myself and certainly anyone in ministry, is because by very nature we are seen when we're performing our ministry. And this is a real warning that if we're doing this because we're up here and we love the gaze of others and we love to be seen, then that's a shortcut to something that's pretty spiritually dead end, because that shouldn't be the reason for doing it. It should be out of love and service to God and certainly other people. There was a study and a survey done a few years ago now by a research psychologist down in England that looked for the top 10 professions that people who are extremely narcissistic and even psychopathic are drawn to. Can you guess what was in that? Clergy were in the top 10. Because there's all this power, there's all this influence. You're all sitting, listening to me as if I know what I'm talking about. And so if you love attention from others, which I'd like to think I don't very much, by the way, I do this in some ways out of a sense of compulsion. But it's absolutely brilliant gig if that's what you're into. And Jesus can see through that. He can see that in the religious leaders of his day. He's saying, I know why you do this. This has got very little to do with God and your own relationship with God, and everything to do with how other people are gazing on. But we can apply that in so many areas of life. You know, what does an authentic spirituality or being a whole human, being a contented whole human look like? You see, this doesn't lead to contentment, because if that's where your worship and your connection to God and your praise leads you, then it's never going to be enough. It's going to be insatiable. You can never have enough people clapping you and saying, well done, and you're so spiritual and you're so holy. It'll run out. But if you know that God is saying, well done, good and faithful servant, and you know that you have that connection to him, that kind of is enough. That is satisfying. In other areas of life, anything that we do, whether that is something good that we're trying to do, silly illustration, but it still happens a lot, is people, quite often in my generation and younger, they would go to do a mission trip in the likes of Africa, but one of the first things they make sure they do is get the camera out so that they can get the photo with the African children they're helping and get that all over social media. And people, something that's really interesting that's happening just now is there's a you might have heard, there's a sort of revival in Kentucky in the United States, and it's happening in a seminary chapel there. And there's a lot of news interest, there's a lot of Christian celebrity interest, and all those people who are turning up who've got a news crew or any reputation, they're just being turned away, because those who are kind of stewarding it are saying, we don't want to sensationalize this. This is just about people encountering God in a spiritual way. It's not for the gaze of others. And if we can remember that, that's actually an amazing way to live our lives. The Reformers called it coram Deo, living life before the face of God. If you can live your life in such a way where, I'm doing this, I believe in who God is, I believe he's holy, I believe he's looking down, I believe that he has loved me in Jesus Christ, and that is actually enough. So that means that if I do things and I don't get the recognition I thought I might have deserved, and I think we do deserve recognition when we do good things, but we live in a very unpredictable world, and it's very, very, very common that we won't get it. But somebody who gets to this maturity in being a disciple of Christ, they become less and less interested in it. The reward is just the doing the thing itself, is doing good works, is doing them quietly. And Jesus gives a lovely picture of that in verse 18, so that it will not be obvious to others that you're fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And some translations say will reward you openly. There's a lovely sort of vignette there into really authentic spirituality. It's a person living before their God, maybe even in secret, maybe hidden away from everyone else, but it's enough. Look at the picture of contentment that gives. If you want to be spiritually content, ask God to take you to the place where you know that him loving you and having forgiven your sins and having called you a child of God, that fills you with a sense of plentiness and of enough. And then watch as God pulls down and reduces and removes the need for anybody else to validate you, to top you up, to give you the pat on the back. Because we're all going to miss out on that at times anyway. But the secret to contentment, according to Jesus, is if you have it with your Father in heaven, particularly as it pertains to your worship. So the gaze and the longing for the gaze and the praise of others is a barrier to it. But God can remove that and make you truly content. And then secondly, in the realm of not just worship, but in possessions, what does he say about that? Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And more pointedly, and this is maybe one of the more controversial sayings of Jesus, in verse 24, no one can serve two masters. You will love one and hate the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, some of your translations will read, you can't serve both God and mammon. What is that? hard to translate, but I would say the best interpretation is that it's leaning on Jesus spoke Aramaic natively, and it's leaning on an Aramaic term that's behind the word for mammon, and it means more than just money. It means money, stroke possessions, stroke property, stroke all the stuff that could be legally attributed to you. If you like, your collection of stuff that you are carrying through life. And Jesus is saying, you can't serve that and God. One of those things will rule you, or the other. Now, it's really stark what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, if that is what you go after in life, and that is what you seek and you pursue, you are not a Christian. It's not me saying that, that's Jesus saying that. And think about it, because in verses then 25 onwards, where he says, don't worry about your life, what you eat, you'll drink, your body, what you will wear, that is wrongly proof texted and used to beat over the Christians over the head and say, you can't have anxiety if you're a Christian, you shouldn't worry. It's antithetical to what Jesus says. But look at the context that Jesus is saying that in. He's just said you cannot worship God and all the stuff and possessions. You'll seek one or the other of those in life. And then he's saying, the antidote to that is don't worry about your possessions, about the stuff that you accumulate in life, because you can't control it anyway. Do you see that group of verses isn't really about anxiety, it's about stuff. And who in our culture doesn't have a problem with stuff? When you go into that cupboard or that room in your house that you know needs a clear out, but you can't face it until maybe later in the year. Our entire system is built on people needing and wanting more and more stuff all the time. Our economy doesn't grow unless people keep buying and wanting stuff. And if our economy doesn't grow, wages stagnate and the rest of society gets hit really badly. Now that's not so much a moral comment as that's an observation. That is the way it is built to work. And you and I are in that conveyor belt and that system. And it's a problem, because if that's the stream that we're swimming in, it's hard to think about it differently. But my goodness, if you think the Bible's outdated and has nothing to say, it is prophetically calling out our culture and our system, saying that's a problem. That could, and in fact that definitely will, corrupt and corrode your soul. Because you're going to be so worried about the stuff that's going to crowd out any contentment you could have in God. And, it's the inverse relationship. People fall into the trap of thinking, well, if I spend more time thinking and strategizing about my stuff and my possessions and my property, whatever it is I have, if I just spend more time sorting it out, then I'll have more time to relax and not be so worried about it. And the opposite is true. It's an insatiable beast that will keep a loop of anxiety and worry going all the time. Why? Because as Jesus alludes to, one day it's all going to be gone, whether through your passing or through there are great stately buildings that were worth billions in their day and they're now ruins. Because with the passage of time, something will happen to corrupt and corrode it. And it's that anxiety that you can never get rid of while you are trying to coddle things and collude your stuff, and while you're trying to have some measure of control over it in your finite humanness. It just amplifies that signal that tells you this is all going to pass. I can't ultimately control this. Do you see why Jesus then says what he says about worry? He's basically saying you can't control it anyway. So stop it, give it up. Get out of that game of trying to worry and control about your possessions and your stuff and find some actual contentment. And watch God at work. Watch him give you contentment. Now, this is not an indictment against, it is not a sin to have money, property, possessions, even to be fabulously wealthy. We reckon that within Jesus' band of disciples, even the likes of Matthew was a pretty well-off guy. We know that he ministered to Zacchaeus. The problem with these guys is it's the seeking of it. It's what is ruling your heart. what is your master? It's impossible to serve these. It's impossible to serve that beast and also be seeking the kingdom of God. I have never seen such a good modern parable of this as, does anyone watch Grand Designs? Have you ever seen the most horrific story ever on that? Was the guy, I think he tried to build a house down in the coast in Devon or somewhere near that, and he was a DJ, he was a music producer, quite successful in the CD era, and that's part of the story. But it was one of those typical properties that continues to grow arms and legs and create more problems. And he started building it when his kids are young, and he wants a house that they can grow up in. And spoiler alert, they never do grow up in it because the project just keeps growing arms and legs. He ends up needing to spend thousands to create a road just to get the kind of materials that he needs in before anything can really be built. Anyway, long story short, it ends up destroying his marriage. His kids end up never being able to live in it. The music industry switches in this time from being CD-based to online, meaning the bottom falls out of most of his source of income, meaning that massively amplifies the level of debt that he's in. He eventually finishes it, massively in debt, but he's lost his wife. His kids have never stayed in it. And, what was the point? He's got a love, you see it at the end. It's majestic, but it's empty and it's cold. And that is the life running after the stuff, the possessions. But if we can allow God to crowbar us away, and that's none of us are going to be able to or even dream about building a house like that, but it can still take a hold of our hearts. You don't need to have much. You just need to have what you have your claws around it in a way that it worries you and you think about it more than you think about God, or you think about having peace, or you think about the relationships in your life. And that's going to come at a different point for all of us. And part of this is difficult because you and I, we've all lived in this post-war world where we've had the greatest acceleration in private and personal wealth in human history, especially after the post-war years. And it became the norm for most people to own and occupy their own houses and so on. Not for everyone, but a lot of people, more than ever before. And now that's reaching an absolute crisis point where it's not really, for people my age and younger, it's maybe not so much the case, or it's extraordinarily difficult. And so even at my stage, I have to renegotiate. Well, maybe that's our generation have to go, maybe we have to rethink. Maybe what we were told would be our birthright in terms of having, a certain benchmark possession like owning your own house. Maybe that's not the case. But for us, that's about going, well, whatever we do have, we can be sure that God will give us contentment with it. And that's where the faith comes in. It's going, maybe the things society promised the generation before us won't materialize, but maybe God will still look after us. Maybe God will still take care of me. And so I don't know what that looks like for you, but it's worth evaluating and asking, am I serving God or stuff? Is stuff hindering me from serving God? Has stuff separated me from God? And do I need to get back to Jesus' radical message of leaving all the stuff for him to worry about so that I can be a disciple and I can feel free, and then I can be free to worship and to give and to love and to serve. Worship, possessions, and finally, provision. The kind of in the middle of the Lord's Prayer is this interesting idea that I spoke about with the kids. Give us each day our daily bread. What does he mean by that? A lot of people here have been speaking to on the hillside and the Sermon on the Mount would have been subsistence living. It would have been getting up, getting some bread for that day and doing it all again the next day. It's harder for us to imagine that in our society and world. Tragically, we're through this year with the cost of living and energy crisis and so on. It has become much more of a reality for many in our community, is that something close to subsistence living. But maybe that's not our problem, and so we're having to think, well, what does he mean by give us our daily bread? Jesus was always, I think, alluding to the Old Testament. I'm always saying that. But can you think of a story in the Old Testament where people had to have bread every day to survive? Remember in the wilderness after the Exodus and they're running out of food and God miraculously provides the manna, which literally means, what is it? I think that's the image Jesus is trying to get them to at the center of here. And I think of that picture of the Israelites in the wilderness. They've got nothing except this connection and dependence on God. And God miraculously steps in and provides this stuff every morning, just enough so that they can all survive and continue to live as his people. Okay? He's trying to get that picture in their head. He's saying, this is what it looks like to be part of my kingdom. It means that you go, God, give me what I need. I'm depending on you for what I need. And again, he's speaking to the subsistence people to say, have enough faith that God will give you what you need. But he's also speaking to the people who are probably quite wealthy. And he's saying, you need to bring your mindset to, I'm actually dependent on God for what I need. I might feel like I've worked hard and I'm self-made and I've produced all of this and that's why I'm very comfortable. But actually, none of that would have been possible if God hadn't gifted me with the power and the strength to work and the intellect that I have and the family and the connections and the society that I was born into and all of that. And he's saying, look up. Fix your gaze on God as the source, the one who has given you everything that you have. That's where the provision comes from. And that is the secret to contentment, is seeing that. Give us our daily bread is an amazing way to live for everyone, regardless of our wealth status or our ability, how much food is in the cupboard or not, because it applies universally. Because it means that if we don't have a lot, then we are trusting God to meet our needs. It means if we have lots and lots and lots, that we never forget in humility that it is God who has blessed us with that, and it's not truly ours, but is lent to us because of his goodness and his grace to us, which we didn't deserve. And that's how we apply that. You see, Jesus had in the Sermon on the Mount the secret to being content, and he still has it, and he still offers it to us. And the great enemies of it are our temptation to live so that others will see it and worship so that others will see it, and also the stuff that we're continually encouraged to consume and to be ruthlessly guarding and jealous of. And he's saying, if you can worship knowing that you just worship God, and that's enough, then you'll be content. If you can see possessions for what they are, something ultimately we won't control, and be grateful to God and love and serve him, we'll be content. And if we can depend on God for our provision, and as well as we can live out life each day, thankful for his grace that he's enabled us to do so, then we'll truly be content. And it's my prayer that all of us, including myself, will learn that contentment. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.